I hope you had a restful night last night. For some of us who took part in the cultural evening last night, I'm not sure how much rest you managed to get, because it was quite a good cultural evening in true Trini style. But it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final seminar of the 49th annual meeting of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank. And this morning we're going to be discussing the very pertinent topic of digitalization for Caribbean development. The bank will be publishing today, and it should be online now, a discussion paper about what should be the priorities for moving our countries into the digital future. Today, at this seminar, we will be discussing these issues in more detail. And I'm very happy to have with us some very great panelists, some who I've managed to bring from very far. Who's flown all the way from Dubai to be with us. And so I think we're going to have a wonderful discussion. Others have flown not so far, but have all come in here from different parts of the Caribbean and are going to be sharing their experiences with us. Now, we're going to run this seminar a little bit different to what we typically do at the Board of Governors meeting. For this seminar, we're going to have 3 chats. When we were thinking about what format we should use, we were saying, oh, we're going to have fireside chats. And then I was reminded we don't have firesides in the Caribbean. So I'll remove that word. We're going to have 3 chats. The first of those discussions will be focused on, well, there are a number of areas that technology are going to have an impact in our lives. And the first of those discussions will be looking at the fintech environment within our region. We have here with us to discuss this topic none other than someone who I consider to be a star of fintech in globally, not only in our region. Mr. Gabriel Abed, who is the founder of Bit.com in Barbados. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what he will be discussing. We also have, with that panel discussion, Professor Avinash Prasad, who is the chairman of the Financial Services Commission in Barbados. And I expect we're going to have a really robust discussion. Huh? The entrepreneur versus the regulator. Should be very interesting. Another discussion that we're going to have includes Mr. David Cox, who's the CEO of Cantor, and he'll be discussing the whole idea of entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs in our region, with again a young person who I think has done marvelous things for our region, Mr. Kirk Anthony Hamilton, who is the founder of Tech Beach, an initiative that we at the Caribbean Development Bank have been supporting over the last 3 years. The final conversation will be about digital transformation in government. And we have none other than a person who I personally consider to be a ministerial star. Someone who I think brings great intellect and a new vision and a new way of thinking in government. And as we said yesterday in our resilience panel, the government of Barbados and the cabinet of Barbados is very privileged to have her as a member. That is the Minister, the Honorable Marsha Cadell, Minister of Economic Affairs of Barbados. She will also be discussing that topic of e-governance with another entrepreneur from Trinidad and Tobago, someone who's also been doing great things in the payment system. His name is Mr. Aldwin Wayne. the CEO of WePay. And so we get a chance again to hear from government and also from the private sector about what needs to happen in order to move the sectors forward. Now, to moderate each of these sessions, we have also fantastic panelists. And I'm very pleased that we managed to get the country manager for the Inter-American Development Bank for the Caribbean region, Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones, a superstar in her own right. You know, I read everything that Therese posts online. She's always a bit step ahead, I think. And really, when you look at the vision that she has for our region, she knows that our future is really digital. So thank you, Therese, for being here. The second moderator will be Ms. Michelle Maris. I want to thank you so much for agreeing to be here with us. You are the coordinator for ICT Pulse. I think a platform that really distributes to the wider region and informs us all about what's going on in the technology space. And I want to thank you for being here and moderating one of these chats with us. Now, audience members, you can go online. We have an application. If you go onto slido.com, I think the information will come up. You can then go in there and find this particular seminar online. And we are asking you to place many of your questions that you might have online. So we're trying to do this in a digital way. You don't necessarily have to come up and ask questions. You can place all of your questions online, and the questions will come up for the panelists, and they will have an opportunity to answer them. You will also have an opportunity to vote on the questions, and so the most voted upon questions will be the ones that the panelists will answer. But before we get into the actual discussions, we have a short video that we would like to present to you, which gives you an indication as to how we see the digital future unfolding within our region for all of the stakeholders here in the Caribbean. So I cue that video now.
Meet Camille. She's from Calypso Bay on the Caribbean nation of Caribe. Owns a clothing design studio, often busy and on the go. There, she's heading out to do chores on a typical day. Her first stop is the bank. There are long lines in the bank. Camille hates long lines. As she's waiting, she starts to think of obstacles to her business. The fact that money transfers are expensive and that clearing raw material and exporting products are so tedious. Her thoughts are interrupted by her son and his pregnant wife. After catching up, her son leaves and Camille returns to her thoughts. This time, she thinks about her soon-to-be-born granddaughter, Alicia. How the time has come for digital IDs for children. She imagines a national IT system where all medical information is saved. How convenient it would be to have school records also saved to blockchain. She thinks about how storing property records on blockchain could also make it easier to transfer her farm to Alicia. Camille also sees Alicia turning the farm into a smart enterprise with irrigation and solar systems that may be monitored in real time. She imagines Alicia signing an agreement with a large company where payment for produce is placed in escrow and automatically released upon delivery. She thinks about a system that combines national social security and tax payments by the time Alicia joins the workforce. When Alicia starts to drive, she'll be able to use metrics for her driving record to get insurance quotations. Camille sees a future for her granddaughter where travel in this region becomes seamless with a unified entry system for CARICOM citizens. And she imagines that all social information for CARICOM countries will be stored in one place so that if Alicia worked in different territories, it would be easy to get a pension in one location. Camille also sees her granddaughter voting online to elect a government and also participating in other civic activities. Her thoughts are once again interrupted, this time by the bank teller. So, what would it take to make Camille's dream come to life? The CDB discussion paper, Digital for Caribbean Development, recommends 4 actions which governments can take to accelerate the move toward digital transformation. The key recommendations are: embed digital skills and literacy to ensure that citizens can participate in the digital economy, enhanced ICT and digital infrastructure development, strengthen legislation, regulation, and data governance, and expedite digitalization of government services. Find out more by reading the paper, Digital for Caribbean Development, #D4CD, which is available on the CDB website, www.caribank.org.
Okay, so now that we've seen Camille's dream, let's discuss how we get there. So first up, I'm going to ask Michelle Marias, moderator, to discuss regulation and governance for digital transformation. To discuss this topic with her will be Mr. Gabriel Abed and Professor Avinash Prasad. Please welcome them.
There we go.
Okay, so thanks very much. The topic we're supposed to be discussing is regulation and governance for digital transformation. And I do think that Camille has some very, I don't want to say ambitious, but I guess very progressive goals that she wishes that we can accomplish. However, one of the things that I perhaps want to start our discussion with is the question, how do you see, and especially probably for both of you who come from a financial services fintech background, how do you see financial services and fintech contributing to the digital transformation of the Caribbean region?
Well, finance is really part of the information industry. It's all about how do you connect, borrowers and savers. So that's about information. How do you find them? How do you connect them? And so finance has always been heavily connected with tech, and there's been lots of disruptive technologies in finance. That's going to continue. Digital transformation is going to have a huge impact on the financial sector. Should make a lot of things easier, quicker, faster, hopefully cheaper, although that's not always been the case in the past. I think in particular, the area we'll see most transformation is in the payment system. Is in getting payments between retailers, consumers across country. Clearly with the correspondent banking challenge in this region, if we can use tech to help us deal with that, that's going to be very important. So it's going to have a major impact. Ultimately though, of course, finance is also about lending. And we need to make sure that is regulated. To make sure that our financial system doesn't go bust and we don't have a lot of systemic risk everywhere. And so the role of technology in that may be different. It may be about more information. But I don't think we're going to see a changed environment where there are no things that we don't recognize as banks who are lending based on rules of credit quality, et cetera.
Okay. Gabriel?
So the question was, how do you see regulation playing a role in digital transformation within our region?
No. Financial services and fintech.
And fintech. Well, financial services and fintech are areas that tend to touch the field of highly regulated industries. And as such, the regulators are really the main gatekeepers behind that innovation. So I find it interesting when the good professor mentions the need for avoiding systemic risk. Absolutely correct. But the main issue comes down to the fact that regulators need to readjust how they regulate in this new order. And what I mean by that is understanding that not providing the correct frameworks or facilities for the advancement of society in and of itself is a systemic risk to the society. And they need to start factoring in the damage that can be done by not being active with regulation, as opposed to acting in a position of avoiding risk. They need to understand that they're creating risk in some instances. And that can hurt the advancement of financial technology. That can hurt the advancement of innovation in society. So what really happens is, and it's important that we do avoid risk at all costs, or where necessary. So what happens is the regulation is setting a floor of where people can't fall below because it provides that netting. But it's also setting a roof of where innovation can't go above. And that has a dramatic cost. So I believe that regulation will play a massive role if taken on the right way. So credit to yourself for the regulatory sandbox. And one of them, I think, in my opinion, a masterstroke move was trying to replicate that sandbox in other jurisdictions in our region and then creating a tunnel between them. And that's the right type of thinking, because if I get approved in one regulatory sandbox as an innovator, I automatically am subject to be approved in the second one. So
we've sort of jumped into financial regulation, which I don't know if that was your intention, but if I were to respond as a regulator, I think it's very important that regulators focus on why we regulate. And actually there are two reasons why we regulate: consumer protection and systemic risk. And we believe that we in Barbados can be a place of innovation if we hold to those two things. Sometimes you hear regulators say, oh, I'm also there to protect the reputation of the jurisdiction, protect integrity. When you start getting vague and overarching, you arm yourself the ability to say no very easily. So we try to narrow down, is consumer protection at risk? Is systemic risk an issue? And if those things aren't a problem, we're happy to allow businesses to operate. Now, we also believe that people can take risks. We're not against people taking risks. The issue is who should take risks in your society. So we don't believe your great aunt with their life savings should be putting it all on the risk of something that she or he may not understand. And so we say, look, if people are of a certain amount of wealth, if they can afford to lose their shirt, we welcome them to take risks. They are the vanguard of risk takers. Great Aunt Agatha is not the vanguard of risk takers. So in the Barbados regime, if Gabriel comes to us with a new idea, we'll say, Gabriel, first, if you can limit it to certain types of people who we don't worry if they lose their shirt, we will regulate that tomorrow. We will happy to accept that tomorrow. But if you're doing a public offer to anyone, people who are quite vulnerable consumers, who may not fully understand what they're doing, who were they to lose, and the whole nature of markets is if some people are winning and some people are losing, and if they lost, they would lose their shirt and we'd be in a very difficult situation, then we want to not say no, but we want to regulate that carefully.
Understood.
Well, my take on that is that there's a retail market out there. While Auntie Betty might be someone that you're trying to protect, we're also limiting the ability for the average consumer, the coconut cutter on the street, for example, to become an investor. And we're restricting the ability for them to get involved in sophisticated products and not moving up the scalability chain in terms of economic value because they're unable to make these investments because a regulator has set limits and barriers to entry. And if we look at something like cryptocurrencies, there's no need for a regulator's involvement in that. Sorry. And what I mean by that is it's
lost half its value in 1 year.
And it's also gained 1,000x in 2 years.
Exactly. Do I want Aunt Agatha's life savings to be doing that over the course of 12 months? No. I'm fine for your life savings to be, but not for Aunt Agatha's.
Right.
So you go ahead and invest it, but we've got to protect certain people. So they can invest in the stock market. There are many things that Aunt Agatha can invest in.
And we can provide limitations and securities around the barriers of where they can go upwards, but to remove the entry barriers, to place entry barriers, I think is a massive hindrance in society. I believe that if you were to go down the road of offering securities, I believe that the average person on the street should have the ability to buy $1 worth of a security. And the problem is right now, it's the issues. One of the bigger issues on unlocking finance and capital in the Caribbean is giving people access to investment products, good investment products. And something like financial innovation can bring those good investment products around. But even more importantly than that, we can start looking about how collateral can be moved around the Caribbean and how securities can be moved around the Caribbean. But even more importantly than that, we can allow entrepreneurs to start sharing their risky projects with the average populace. And the populace gets to take the decision on maybe a limited investment quota, but nonetheless still have exposure to go and buy into John's taxi stand that's looking to expand across the region. And these kind of opportunities.
And we're supporting that. There's a spectrum of investment products. Most people in a bank are earning today 0.2%. You could earn maybe 1,000% on a risky product. Tons of space in between. Crowd financing, where we get the crowd to invest in Uncle John's coconut stand, we are encouraging that. And the rates of returns one can obtain on those things, maybe 10, 12, 15%. There's a whole spectrum of things. What we're saying is that we want the public to be involved in things and be exposed to as many things as possible, but we want to limit who could be in a very serious problem. Not eliminate, not say no, but limit who can be exposed to something at the riskiest end. And that's the way we promote innovation. That's where we get these new products in, and people can then prove. You can prove to us, we've done this thing, we've done it for 1,000 qualified people, no risks at all. You were overly scared about this. And then we would say, open it up.
Question. Do you think that there is or should be a difference between a finance company that is investing in technology or a tech company that is focusing on financial services?
Absolutely. Two fundamentally different things. One's a VC company, a venture capitalist firm that wants to invest in technology, and their activities are completely different. And the other is an organization that, through the use of software frameworks, is able to bring around a new financial paradigm that is worthy of investment by the VCs. So the two are completely and fundamentally different. In my opinion, maybe I understood the question wrong.
So where we think about things is not what they're called. It's what is the activity.
Right.
So if something's called a tech company, but it's actually doing investing, then we view it as a financial company. If it's a financial company, it's actually just doing tech. It's just doing payments. It's not taking risk. We actually approve those very quickly on the basis that actually they're not taking financial risk. There's no real capital required behind that. And so we focus on the activity. What is the activity?
So the fundamental of that kind of mindset is there's a new generation of offerings hitting the internet, and some of us have heard of them. And usually they are, to the professor's point, massive risk and scams. But there's some of them that are legitimate. They're called initial coin offerings. And there's software companies actively in Barbados and across the region, spread well across the region, that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars to build these protocols. Now, the interesting part about that is these protocols cannot be regulated. While you may want to deem this software company, they've released a bundle of code and lines of mathematics that serve a particular intention on the internet, there's absence of contract. If everyone in that organization were to be wiped off by a bus, the network is still alive. It exists on the internet, and it doesn't exist on one computer. It exists on thousands, if not millions, spread across the world. And these systems use blockchain technology on the back end. Remember, the only thing that makes blockchain cool is the fact that it's an immutable ledger. No one can destroy it. They can't edit the records. They can't forge them. And because of that main security aspect, you're eliminating a lot of trust. you're eliminating a lot of jobs as well, the jobs of regulators, the jobs of central banks, the jobs of accountants, in some cases.
But Gabriel, I saw a figure, tell me if it's wrong, that
Sure.
80% of these ICOs have failed.
Sure, and 90% of startups fail.
Right. So that's why we don't allow, ICOs to be on a public offer to everybody.
But
we will allow an ICO on a limited basis to those people, qualified investors, who we don't mind if they lose their share.
And I think that's where we differ, is because you say
Yes, it
allow,
is.
you say allow where you assume you can enforce, and a regulator is only as good as their enforcement. And the issue with an ICO is, once again, there's absence of contract, there's absence of organization, there's absence of centralized entity. There's no one person, there's anonymous groups building out these protocols on the internet that then support a certain function. Whether that function is a medical record system that gives the end user absolute control of their data, but the entire record-based system is controlled by no central party, that can be released as an ICO in theory. And the issue with that is a regulator from a particular jurisdiction can't come and tell somebody they can't invest in that. Furthermore than that, there's on-ramping systems, whether it's using your credit card or cash with over-the-counter or even Bitcoin. To enforce that right now it's stand outside and scream at the clouds, and you get the same.
I used to think that. And in fact, I went on the radio once making that very point about 20 years ago, that finance had moved to cyberspace, that we couldn't regulate finance. And then I became a director of a bank. And I became personally liable for making sure that I knew where the money came from all of the customers of the bank. And then I began adopting I collect some lost causes, and one of them was a financial transaction tax. The UK has a financial transaction tax. The UK is one of the world's biggest stock exchanges, international market, and so lots of people trading the stock market in the UK from all over the world online, and they all pay the financial transaction tax. Now, why do they do that? So an American using a French bank going through Hong Kong to buy a UK share pays the UK regulator's tax. Why? Because the contract is not legally enforceable unless they do so. Unless it's stamped, it's not legally enforceable. No one wants to own an asset where they cannot legally enforce it. So regulators have power. Money is not anonymous. We track money. That's why we have correspondent banking problems. We track money very closely, and the regulators must make sure they're not in the way of innovation. We try to be very supportive of it. The business model follows the regulatory model. We've got to get the regulatory model right and the right balance, but do not believe that regulators do not have power and influence. Money is a regulated activity.
Right. And on that notion, it just perfectly plays into the exact point that I was making, is that I believe our regulators need to change their mindset and move away from the centralized models of how things are managed. And I think it's critical more now than ever that that single statement is paid attention to by our regulators, because the idea of working in a bank is subject to the centralization of the traditional business market. But the way we're going and the way technology is moving is towards decentralization of activities, of involvements of all facets of the financial activity. And the goal of a regulator at that point is...
I agree with you completely,
But the goal of a regulator at that point is to not try to work with innovation once it comes out. It's rather try to ensure that there's an opening path for innovation ahead of it coming up, because you can't tell where innovation is going to come from. It can come from anywhere. But instead, it's to ensure that you don't step ahead of it before it even exists.
Which is why we should not be technology platform driven. We should encourage any innovation anywhere. And our issue should not be what is the technology. Our issue should be, is the system at risk? And most of the time, the system is not at risk. So we tick that box. Are there vulnerable consumers at risk? If you come and tell us that there are no vulnerable consumers at risk, we say yes, we want innovation. But I come back to that point, that you have to decide not yes or no to innovation. You have to decide if you really want to be innovative. If you decide yes or no to innovation, you're going to end up pushing back innovation. What you have to say is who do you want to be innovative? And that's your pathway to innovation. If you say, I will accept any innovation there is, I just want to determine who is going to be the vanguard and exposed to that, which is what we do. We say we will accept anything if you start off with a set of people who we don't care if they lose their money. And if you prove to us, having done that, that this is safe, we broaden it out.
So I have two questions for you. I'm a software developer in Barbados. I design an ICO, and let's just say it. It's a protocol that takes chats and encrypts them and gives the user their end user chat data, like a Facebook that you control your own data, or instant messenger. I release this protocol on the internet, and a bunch of Bajans or Barbadians go and buy into this protocol because it now has a limited value or a limited existence. In other words, there's only 100 million tokens, and every time you use this chat, it's going to cost you 5 cents of a token. Users start to love this chat system. It picks up value because of utility, and that token rises. A bunch of Barbadians buy it. A good competitor comes out, and my token system crashes. I, as a Barbadian, have built, released, and designed this system, and have released this code to the internet, which then got picked up by exchanges, digital asset exchanges, regulated ones around the world, and end users started buying into it. A bunch of Barbadians now lost their shirts because of it, and they went and bought it under the table. Am I going to be prosecuted under your...
Of course not. You're selling software.
I didn't get your permission.
But let me explain. Because if you are selling some software to the world, you're not selling a financial product. Where someone buying the thing that you are selling exposes them to substantial risk.
But that is an ICO, Professor.
No. We are only concerned. We will approve anything as long as what we're concerned with is there a public offer of an instrument where the buyer of that instrument can have significant loss.
Okay.
And that's when we start to regulate it.
So in this new world, there's initial...
But selling a book which might talk about dangerous things is not regulated. Selling a piece of software or code that other people have to use. So who is selling the instrument? We regulate who is selling the instrument and the activity.
The Barbadian software company that released it is
not selling the financial instrument.
They would have held a portion of the tokens as part of their service as income.
If they're selling it as a financial instrument to the public, then yes, that's regulated. And wouldn't we want anyone selling financial instruments to be regulated?
Absolutely.
Question, and just looking at the screen, one of them, just going back
because we haven't got off your first question, have we?
That's all right. And I love where the discussion is going. Going just back to the focus on cryptocurrencies and looking at the second question, given the anonymous nature of cryptocurrency, how can regulators or legislators protect the system from nefarious activity that undermine a system?
May I? So the first thing is cryptocurrencies are not anonymous. They're pseudonymous. You can easily work out the identity of it. The second thing behind it is one of the most nefarious activity happens over the paper-based, cash-based system, as a matter of fact. You wouldn't be wise to use blockchain technology for nefarious activity. And I say that because you're literally storing your illegal activity on the world's most perfect paper trail system. And applied mathematics in the form of chain analytics, chain analysis, and there's 1,000 companies out there that have built their entire business model around tracking, tracing, maneuvering, and monitoring suspicious activity, illicit activity, and nefarious activity on these chain systems to turn around and go to data processing units and regulators and agencies and companies like our own, Bit.com in Barbados, to focus on providing them this kind of data so that they can make informed decisions about their transactions. So I would say that it is a regulator's best friend to want someone to try to attempt to do illicit activity on these types of networks.
I agree with that. I mean, this notion that money is anonymous is misguided. And blockchain actually gives us a pathway to see the path, and indeed such a clearer pathway that it may be a way that we can actually improve our controls on anti-money laundering, etc., on correspondent banking concerns. So we as regulators are not technology platform driven.
Okay, good to know. So just a couple more things because we need to begin to wrap up shortly. And going back now to the whole focus of digital transformation and financial services, fintech, and how those could contribute to digital transformation in the region. Based on the CDB's paper that I think is published today, one of the things that they spoke about is digital literacy. And I'm also concerned about just inclusion, because it's all well and good sometimes when we're talking about Camille, who has a business and seems to be exposed to technology, but what about a lot of the people who are at the base of the pyramid? How could financial services, fintech, help in facilitating and driving digital transformation?
Professor, may I?
Yes, please.
So I want to start off by thanking the CDB for not just hosting this event, but actually launching the Caribbean Settlement Network on April 25th, I believe. And the reason why that's important as a side topic to what we're talking about here is the Caribbean Settlement Network, was designed with a notion of building out a legal and regulatory framework that all of the Caribbean islands can look at and follow, which will then set a standard and uniform way that we can come together to start exploring things along the lines of intercentral bank settlement, direct currency swaps, multilateral clearing facilities, and a list of other financial activities and events that have a trickle-down effect to that end user. That end user on their smartphone can now send Barbados digital dollars to a St. Lucian real time. If the right policies are in use, within seconds of two governors making an economic agreement, that economic agreement can be represented in code and enacted to that end user in real time. So let's just look at the example of a direct currency swap between two central banks, let's say the Eastern Caribbean and Barbados as an example. The possibility of being able to transfer Barbadian to Eastern Caribbean dollars can be as simple as the system being live and a contract being represented as a smart contract within code. And the implications of being able to see that type of system live and active, it's dramatically going to change the way that we do financial services in the Caribbean. It's going to change the way that we receive payments, send payments, remit payments.
Right.
And it's not just going to do it for this region, it's going to have implications globally, as we've already seen with central bank digital currencies, which, by the way, the Caribbean was the first to lead the charge on. The Eastern Caribbean Central Bank with Dr. Timothy Antoine as an example. So we have situations right now where the underlying financial inclusion and ability for the small guy to be banked with advanced financial services, it's well on its way because of some regulators in our region who have started looking the right way.
So I think I want to approach that in two different ways. I think the first thing to say is that we need to digitize our economies. There's no question about that. They're going to be huge benefits from that. But we have more fundamental problems than that.
Exactly.
The technology revolution has accelerated dramatically since the 1970s. Imagine, some of you are too young to do that, but imagine we were back in the 1970s. I mean, this was before the miniaturization of silicon chips, before miniaturization of computers, before the internet, before the Internet of Things and all this stuff. Economic growth was faster than it is today. Economic growth from the post-war to the 1970s was faster than it's been since. So these things are very important, but we've got some fundamental problems we have to change, for which digitization is one of the solutions, can help us. A classic one in the Caribbean is that we are a region which actually is not short of savings. We have a lot of savings. We have about $40 billion of savings around the region. In Barbados, we have around $10 billion of savings. Our challenge is mobilizing domestic savings for investment. And we have missing markets in our financial sector. We have banks that are collateralized lenders. They basically only want to lend for mortgages and cars. And they don't want to lend for anything else. So we've got all these savings, earning 0.1%, not doing stuff. Missing markets. We've got to create new financial instruments in which we can get people lending and investing. It doesn't have to be extremely risky, 1,000% type returns. It can be, we've got a crowd financing company in Barbados that's entered the niche of around 12% returns. Crowdfunding for young startup businesses. We need to fill these missing markets, and I believe digitization will help a lot. And many of these products are essentially digital. They don't have branches. They're about information online. Much of this can be done online. And the final thing I'd like to say is that, I mean, I probably pushed you in our earlier conversation to talk a bit about finance, but a lot of digitization is not about finance.
Exactly.
In Barbados, we wish to digitize our government, digital government. We want every single process to be done 24/7 online. We believe that will make a dramatic impact on the way people access government services. And that will speed it up. One of the things I like to say is that every 1 day you waste in a government office waiting on a driving license or whatever, it's 0.25% of GDP growth. And most of our people are spending not 1 day, but 4, 5, 6 days. So let's eliminate that. We will get some growth. But let's not think that that is an end in itself, because we have deep structural problems, inequality problems. You know, real wages have not risen for the majority of people living in advanced economies since 1980, despite the technology revolution. So we've got a lot of things to do besides technology in changing our society.
So in wrapping up, I would have to say that I fundamentally disagree with the professor on that note. I think technology is the cornerstone right now to our success and would be the greatest thing to grow efficiency across the board. I mean, have you ever stood in the line for a driver's license or a passport or a national ID? Or when was the last time you had to use a government service? How was that experience? How many hours did you spend waiting in that line instead of being useful to your economy? And I mean, this is across the board, from our airport systems to our banking services. You can't go anywhere without it being physical, in person, and inefficient.
Yes.
And that's just on one aspect of it. You're not even talking about the background side of data movement and activities amongst government, or governance itself, the amount of inefficiency in the governance of a country, the activity of managing resources. You talk about, you don't think that's that is the fundamental priority, and that is the problem that we're not facing right now, that we're not taking seriously. This is a cancer. It's prevalent. You know, we just talked about, I just returned from Dubai. You want to see amazing? Go to Singapore, go to Dubai, where you need a new SIM card from Virgin, they show up at your doorstep. You want a bank account? They're showing up at your doorstep. You need a doctor? He's at your doorstep. You want gas in your car? A mobile truck is pulling up from an app and filling up your car, wherever it is. I mean, every last part of the society is efficient. And it starts to make you wonder, why are we not doing it back there? And you step into that and you realize, well, it's because we're not taking it seriously. And we don't realize that it's the most critical thing we can do. It's the most critical thing we can do right now in our societies to unlock the problems that we have today. It is a cancer. That mindset is a cancer. And we need to abolish it. We need to turn to every last facet of our society and attack it with technology, because technology brings around efficiency because it eliminates human error. Human error is bad, okay? It's really bad, and it causes problems. and the truth is, right now, you know, we also talk about the cornerstone right now that we need to solve is collaborating as a region, which we don't do. We have Grenada and Barbados and Bermuda and Jamaica. Jamaica's national ID system just failed. Trying to do national ID. Guys, can you come together and use the various service providers, brainstorm, spend 6 months and build a regional national ID system where every time I go to a bank, I don't have to re-verify myself, AML, KYC.
We need to do these things, but let's get real.
But that one
things.
facet unlocks everything,
Yeah,
and then you move from there.
But you know what? If we don't change the level of skills in our country, if we don't change the level of public health in our country, if we don't change income inequality in our country, those things we will still not grow.
And if we don't implement technology, those things will be prevalent and they will continue to grow even worse.
Gabriel, there are matters of faith and there are matters of empirical study.
There's matters of fact and there's matters of opinion.
There are matters of fact and there are matters of faith. And the fact has been, we have done technology in many places, and it is not alone, that does not alone transform our economy. We have much to do. One necessary thing, but much else to do.
But what transforms it, Professor, if I may just end it with 4 key words: transparency, accountability, and integrity. And that's
Totally
what technology brings.
Totally agree.
Those 3 things. Without technology, you cannot hold people accountable because there's no chain of custody, there's no records, there's no provability, then there's no integrity because there's no transparency. The systems collapse and fail time and time again. I'll end there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should give the panelists and Michelle a wonderful round of applause. That's exactly the type of start we wanted to this seminar on digitalization. But now we're going to switch focus a bit. I'm going to ask Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones to come to the podium and to ask Mr. David Cox and Kirk Anthony Hamilton to come forward and discuss the digital transformation to enable innovation and entrepreneurship. Therese, over to you.
Wow, I'm glad I wasn't on that panel. We're going to bring this to reality and what I think is also the potential of what digitalization can really do for this region. First of all, I want to congratulate CDB for taking on this topic, because for those of you who've been working with me at the IDB for the last 3 years, we've been on this journey for a long time. I'm really also impressed to be sitting up here behind a sign that says transformation, and it's not related to anything spiritual. So I think this is the biggest mindset change at the CDB I've seen since I've been coming to CDB meetings. So a round of applause for CDB. So going back to that amazing animated video we saw at the beginning, I want to go back to Camille, because Camille had a vision for her granddaughter. But actually, I see myself as Camille, and I'm not going to wait for my granddaughter to get to where the granddaughter in the video wants to be, because I think we're actually closer to getting to the reality that we need in this region, because there's been quite a bit of progress. So just a couple of data points, and I know all of you know this, but it's a good thing to remind you. So there are 9 billion mobile devices, probably more 9 billion, close to 10 billion now, but 9 billion of these around the world. There are about 1.5 million robots already in existence. There are something like, just to give you the right number, there are, 23 billion connected devices already. And this is the Internet of Things, this is 5G. So all of our providers, and I'm going to single out Flow and Cable and Wireless, even though we're not, David is here to talk in his Cantu head, but we want to talk about what's going on in the world, the exponential growth in technology we're seeing. You know, every 2 years, the chip doubles its capacity. The world that Avi was describing with regulation can't keep pace with what's happening actually in the world, because all of us really want to live our lives with our mobile device. But in the Caribbean, this is really difficult to do. So I'm going to open up with a general question for these two guys to say, where are we really in getting Camille, not her granddaughter, getting to Camille to the reality of being able to do those things? Avi also described it. To have all of our government services connected, to have this region functioning in a digital way and not an analog way, because basically we're living in an analog world in the Caribbean. I just came back from St. Thomas, and the transportation system there drove me nuts. There's a guy with a walkie-talkie in the vehicle and a cell phone, and he's controlling the base, and he's got 5 people in the vehicle, and he's trying to run the transportation system that way. So, Kirk, Tech Beach and what you're trying to do, what do you see, and how far are we from realizing this dream?
Interesting start. Thank you very much. So I would say it's kind of twofold. On one end, we're extremely far along in the sense that a lot of the solutions that we're looking for actually exist. On the other end, we are very far behind in the sense that we as a region have so far failed to truly adapt into the new global dynamic that exists. And so if I even look at the the last panel discussion, you can kind of see that tension that is arising in the sense that we have 2 whole different playing fields at odds with each other. And the challenge in the region, I would argue so far, is that these 2 worlds are not managing to meet in a way that truly drives progress and collaboration. From my end, what I would encourage and simply state today is that we live in a space where there are certain inevitabilities, and we have to decide where as a region we want to go. But the fact is that we're not going to stop the movement of technology and innovation, and therefore there has to be some coming together in order for us to advance. And that is where we're stalling, is that these 2 bodies are not able to meet in a way that causes meaningful and positive outcomes.
David, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. First, let me just say what an incredible honor it is to be here and to have been invited by the CDB in my capacity as chairman of Canto. So thanks to whoever had that particular stroke of genius. Just kidding. I think that the Caribbean, if I had to grade the Caribbean, I would say that it's a mixed bag. I'd give it a solid sort of C+. I think in the region we have a tendency to overstate how far back we are because we are often playing catch up as a developing part of the world in so many ways. And the progress toward real digital transformation can often seem overwhelming. But I think just for the purposes of the discussion, it's important or helpful rather, for me to try to break down our journey in 2 spheres. Often when we talk about digitization and transformation and digital economies, the reality is that the presumption in most people's minds is focused on governments. And they are focused on the work or the lack of progress that governments in the region are making in making sure that it will be possible for you, for example, to get on your phone and say that you need, open an app, say that you need to get your passport replaced, send in the information digitally, and then go to the passport office and pick it up the next day or have it delivered to your house. People are frustrated about the fact that the governments in the region appear to be so far behind. We want to see the progress that we know that the technology can provide in helping make our societies more efficient. The challenge that, and if you think about it, that entire video that we saw with Camille, almost all of it was really focused on the things that governments need to do to enable that transformation. If we look at that sphere, the reality is that the report card is poor. And we can talk about some of the reasons for that, and I have some particular theories about that, but that's the reality. And this isn't an indictment by me on our regional governments. I think that the problem is complex, and the factors which are leading to this state of affairs are multiple. So it's not intended as a criticism, merely as an observation of fact. On the other hand, the reality is that digital transformation is fundamentally driven by entrepreneurs, by the private sector. That the true transformation that's going on in the region is being led by people like Kirk, who is using technology to advance the mission of the region in a new and novel way and is adding value. But we should also not forget that the entrepreneur is not just amazing people like Kirk. Entrepreneurs also in our Caribbean context, the hairdresser, the barber. One day, I'll tell a quick story. I was here about 10 years ago, and I stopped by the side of the road. I don't know where it was, and I had the most amazing doubles with this fantastic tamarind chutney, and it changed my life. I've never been able to get it since, despite many visits to Trinidad. But one day, somebody, some entrepreneur in Trinidad and Tobago who makes fantastic doubles is going to decide that they'll create an app and they'll sell their doubles and have them delivered to business places and to offices and to whoever orders them. And they'll expand their business and become rich in what seems overnight, even though it might have taken them several years. That kind of innovation is going on in the Caribbean every single day. I worked with someone who left their job, retired early, so that they could start a startup company directed to small businesses to provide financial accounting services to small businesses. So the innovation that is happening other places in the world is going on in the private sector in the region. And it's important for us not to lose sight of that. I want to close this by, this opening comment with one more observation, which is that we need to remember also that everything we're talking about, whether on the government side, public sector side, or on the private sector side, is dependent on connectivity. It is dependent on private investments by companies like Cable and Wireless or Digicel or any operator who is spending money to extend networks into our societies. We need that connectivity to get people in rural communities connected, etc. And those things can be helped or hindered by good government policy and poor government policy. And that's why the dialogue is important.
Yeah. So let me just add another fact here. So the UN e-Government Development Index of 2018 ranks 3 Caribbean countries out of, well, the 6 for which I have data. 3 are above the world average: Barbados, Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago. 3 are well below: Suriname, Jamaica, and Guyana on e-government readiness. The Global ICT Development Index of 2017, same 3 countries rank above the average, and the same 3 countries well below. So this gives you an idea of that there is progress, there is potential, but we have a lot of work to do. So how do we move beyond knowing that at least half of the countries in this region, these are big countries, big leaders in the region, who are almost ready to embrace technology to improve the digital platforms of government. Apart from the infrastructure, we hear a lot about there's not enough connectivity, there's not enough bandwidth, there's not enough coverage, there's not enough penetration. From your, where you sit, what are the companies in the ICT world who are the providers of all the connectivity we need in this region? What needs to be done next to move us to this other level?
Well, first of all, let me just add a perspective. We focus a lot when we talk about digitization on, frankly, fixed wireline broadband in the homes, but the mobile penetration rates for the Caribbean are through the roof, largely over 100% in a number of these islands. And the fact is that people are now able to access a greater level of speed from their phones than they do or can at their homes. That is a significant transformative tool, which I think we don't think about enough. I think the issue on the private sector side is that we need to we need to encourage the companies on whose, the networks on who we depend to continue to invest in those networks. And it's incredibly difficult in this age of disruption. The competition has changed. Technology is disrupting the industry. And therefore, I think the key question is, what are the right types of policies that governments need to think about in order to continue to encourage that investment? And very briefly, we need to think about, I think we need to think about the the pace of regulation, the type of regulation, governments need to recognize that at the moment, the industry is so disruptive that a too invasive approach to regulation is detrimental. We need to collaborate for rural communities and think about reducing the bureaucracy, in particular in regional telecoms regulators in particular, around things like spectrum. The reason that spectrum is important is because companies like TSTT and others can provide meaningful solutions to connect people in rural communities in Trinidad and Tobago using spectrum that is resilient, that provides high levels of speeds at a more efficient, at certainly more efficient sort of levels than they would if they had to extend physical wires, et cetera, into those communities. And we need to get to those poor and rural communities.
There's a really hot question here on Slido. Will telecoms change their current business model of charging per megabyte, per MB, I guess, to unlimited data to unleash access to information and promote more digital services? Do you have a response to that?
They're already doing that. I mean, if you look at the cost of data across the region, the cost of data has been going down, exponentially. And in Jamaica, for example, Cable and Wireless just recently released a number of new products in which customers have unlimited, they can speak to each other and without cost, and they pay for data, but the data packages are huge. Now, those types of products are going to have a huge transformational effect on societies in Jamaica, on societies like Jamaica.
For me, that's a leading indicator that Caribbean citizens want to do more business on their mobile devices.
Absolutely.
Right? I want to be, just like in Estonia, I want to be able to vote from my phone, open up a business on my phone in 18 minutes, including a bank account. I want to be able to make a doctor's appointment, check into my son or daughter's class to see what's going on in real time, right? All of this technology is available, but somehow we're not there yet. So, Kirk, tell us how Camille, is that going to happen or not?
Well, first I'd like to jump in on the part that I think, firstly, too often in the region, we are way too satisfied with the idea of where we are as opposed to where we can be. And so you hear these, anecdotes that suggest that, there's a lot of activity, for example, happening, and, there are offerings in places like Jamaica that are, on some end, supposedly, world class and such. And I'm Jamaican. I love Jamaica. I'm the biggest champion of the island. However, I speak to something different, right? So in 2013, I co-founded an investment firm in the US. We raised some capital from high net worth individuals in the Caribbean, and we went about looking to buy into mobile app development companies in the United States. And when I decided to depart that business, one of the things that I walked away with was I said to people, one, it was getting the story out there was a bit difficult. Two, when we bought into these app development businesses, one of the things we said as a growth strategy was we can come into the Caribbean and sell this service to large corporates. That's what we said to the app development firms, as any private equity kind of deal maker would. And we hit brick walls in the region when we tried to get them on board with this concept. And so when I stepped away, which was about 5 years ago, I started to say, 5 years from now, a few things are going to happen. The words in innovation and disruption are going to become pitch words in the Caribbean, which were already pitch words in advanced markets. I won't say everywhere else in the world. And I also said that every large corporate is going to end up then wanting to have apps. And so said, so done. But one of the realities back then, which is starting to unfold now, is that technology doesn't wait. And so now we're living in a realm where those same mobile devices that you're talking about are changing and transforming. And so now when we want apps, the providers are moving to a different system, right? The developers of technology are moving to something else, and we are not on the same playing field, right? So the major challenge that I see, whether you talk about government, private sector, et cetera, is simply the fact that in the modern landscape, which I consider to be multidisciplinary, multidimensional, we often fail to recognize where these overlaps come together, which ultimately is a space where new enterprise is created. And so, you know, the guy making doubles who could ultimately transform, you know, what is a fairly, is an extremely analog business into something that is able to grow through some kind of digital connectivity, so far has been unable to meet at a point where all the different pieces required for that enterprise to be created are able to come together in somewhat seamless fashion. And the reality is that entrepreneurship is hard anywhere in the world, right? It is tough to take something from, well, it's tough to take nothing and turn it into something. However, you know, when you have a real ecosystem that is designed to support business and designed, more importantly, to support something that is very important here in the concept of new enterprise, right? Something coming from nowhere. You know, we simply don't have that fabric. We don't have a fabric that allows a certain level of individuality to reach its maximum potential and see the light of day and turn into something that creates not just wealth, but opportunity for many others. Yeah. So that's where we want to go. And
this point is heavily linked to this hot question about how do we move beyond just the basic digitalization to massive transformation, right? I mean, I know Avi and I spent a lot of time talking about it's not just about digitalization, it's about all the other things. But in my mind, they're all connected, whether it's the 5-year-old after early childhood education being educated in a different way. There's a whole supply chain that needs to be adjusted in the mentality of every Caribbean person, and that has to start very early. And we're not there yet. And the other point, the other question here is yes or no, do the policymakers get it? And I don't think it's just a question of generational. I know we've talked a lot about that. Is it a generational thing, or, you know, our new leaders will definitely be different because they're younger and they've grown up on the smartphone. But do they really get this bigger picture out there that we have to transform every aspect of how the region works? And we haven't even talked about these other threats that are on us of climate change and the need to build resiliency. And you can do that if we're operating differently. Comments?
So my thing would be, firstly, we need to start using terms like rethink and reinvent. There is a need for what I would consider, without, you know, placing any insult on the systems that already exist, to really start thinking about a level of overhaul if we're going to achieve the things that we are discussing, you know, getting towards. You know, the panel that was up here earlier, I think, touched on this point in many areas. If, you know, transformation is a real word, right? And it has a lot of, it comes with a lot, right? And there is a whole mindset shift that needs to occur. That's the kind of work that we are pursuing with our platforms. But ultimately, when you talk about, you know, developing an ecosystem, you talk about developing a pipeline, there are all these different layers. And it needs to start, as you mentioned, from early childhood education. But at the same time, we can't forget about those who are at what may be perceived at an end. And we can't forget about people like myself who are kind of in the middle, where, you know, we started using computers relatively early, but we weren't born with them in our hands and such like that. Because, you know, in order for us to, I wasn't taught to build what we have managed to build. And I've always said to people, it's one of the most interesting things. I have a friend who's a doctor from the Caribbean, went through the entire process as we all know it, moved to Toronto, called me one day as an entrepreneur and said, you know, Kirk, one of the things that I'm realizing, and it's not just a Caribbean thing, but when you think about entrepreneurship, when you think about technology, you think about innovation, why is it that we weren't taught, when you walk onto an elevator, to have the thought, you know what, could this be done better? And that ultimately really is what entrepreneurship is. That ultimately is what innovation is. And you have to nurture that. And I would, again, kind of emphasize on the point that in the traditional system that I grew up in the Caribbean, I was never taught to think in that way. Where I got a lot of that thinking from was when I went to art and design school to study architecture, and I was with a bunch of, what would be considered misfits in this part of the world. And I observed them thinking in these, extreme outward manners that I used to think was crazy, until I started accepting and realizing that, all they are doing is perceiving a world that they want, as opposed to the world that they're living in. Whereas what I was doing was I was developing and showcasing things that I knew could be done, but not what, I wasn't thinking broad enough and imagining far enough. So that was a huge impact on me, and I would argue that that is a very necessary asset in order to create a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem.
So we have just under 2 minutes. David, so do the policymakers get it? And what do they really need to get?
No,
what do we want them to get?
No, they don't, and that's because...
We have a lot of them in this room.
I'm sorry. I never said it. No, unfortunately not. And I think I've mentioned this, my view is that that's because there's a generational shift that needs to happen at the policy level. A lot of our Caribbean leaders are born at a time when the world was still very analog, and so the imagination necessary to understand in a real way. They understand it intellectually. Caribbean people are extremely bright. So they understand it intellectually, but emotionally, they don't yet understand or perceive how the technology should be used, and why it's so absolutely necessary to do it with urgency. If I could just synthesize a couple of points, and because Kirk makes I think a very fundamental point about there is a cultural problem. There are two major challenges I see in the Caribbean. There are others, but in the time that I have left, there are two major challenges I see. One is cultural, as he points out. We have a colonial inheritance of an educational system which encourages, for lack of just for speed of thought, servitude. So it encourages, it's a very grammar school type oriented education system, which encourages people to sort of go through a traditional, process of learning, and then which requires them often to be employees. We don't have an education system which encourages a lot of risk-taking. That needs to change, but that's a broader cultural thing. The more fundamental thing that needs to happen at a policy level is that governments need to invest far more heavily, far more directly, with far more urgency in coding in an education system which promotes risk-taking, but which also exposes people to the basic building blocks of creating software and creating code. And if we can do that, I think we will see some of the transformation. The other, and I'll end on this point, the other fairly significant challenge we have is venture capital, is money. Kirk's success is directly related to the fact that he could get access to funding at some point that believed in the ideas that he had and could empower it. In the example I use of this person making the doubles, that person would need to be able to get somebody who could build an app if they couldn't. In order to build an app, you need to have the skills. Once you build it, in order to be able to get that person, you need to be able to pay them. And then as that company grows, you need investors to help it. Those are the missing links, the skills, the money. Having said that, we are still doing great things in the region. We are not where we need to be, but we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves.
Yeah. No, I see there's a lot of energy around this topic now. I'm so glad to see CDB is on board. The light is flashing red, but this last point of should internet access be a human right, I would say yes. I think we're headed that way. I think the UN's going to eventually get there. And to take another leaf out of the Estonians book, they used to have 3 virtues as emblematic of what Estonia is. And the first one was mother, for obvious reasons. The second one was bread. Everyone has to eat. The third one is forest, take care of nature. And now the fourth one is internet, and Wi-Fi. So that's where I want to end this. We need a similar set of real clear objectives and goals in this region. I think we can get there. All the partners in this room know how to do this. There was a question about how can development multilaterals and others help? How can our partners help? It's what you want to do. We finance in the IDB challenges that you have and where you put the priorities, and the same for the CDB. So we look forward to working on these issues in the future.
Well, I know we're wrapping. I
Yes.
just wanted to share then that, based on David's final comments and even yours, ultimately what we've been working to create with Tech Beach and our other platforms is that new ecosystem that is necessary for the kinds of businesses that people want to design now to thrive. And again, I kind of reflect on the last panel just to say, when we talk about where the policymakers are and where we need to go, the reality that I tend to try to share with people is that tomorrow looks nothing like today. The kinds of businesses that people want to build look nothing like the ones that we have now. And the people who are going to end up building these businesses do not look like the people who have built the ones that we currently engage with. And so the most important thing I think that we need to get to in terms of our policymakers and institutions and such like that, again, is really reaching to a point where people come together towards an understanding, because currently there's a huge disconnect. And the disconnect simply is that people do not comprehend each other in this space currently, especially in this region. And when we get to the point where you can understand that, to that same thing that I said earlier, the businesses will not look the same as what we're seeing out there. When we get to a greater point of understanding is when I think you will start to see the kind of shifts necessary for success in this part of the world to happen in this category of new business.
Yeah. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, just another round of applause for that wonderful panel. Now we're going into our final panel discussion around digitalization. And here we're going to be speaking about e-government, moving government towards the digital platforms. And I want to invite Minister Marsha Cadell to the stage, as well as Mr. Aldwin Wayne, who's the CEO of WePay. Yeah. And I'm going to moderate this one. Okay. I think we've had some really great discussions so far. But now we've come to speak about I think we're getting into the meat of the matter, really around digital transformation for governments. Let me just relate to you a story that I know. This could be personal. I know someone who wants to renew their passport. The passport they renewed only 5 years ago. They must now renew it again. In order to do so, they've heard that there are long lines at the passport office. So it might be better for them to go to a more rural location to renew their passport. When I think about a story like that, it frustrates me. It reminds me of a presentation that I heard from Mr. Michael Leachin, who's the chairman of the Economic Growth Council in Jamaica. And he said at that presentation, every time the Economic Growth Council met, he encouraged members of that Growth Council to get angry. Angry about why is Jamaica where it is now and how are we going to move forward. I think for most of us in the room now, I think we're getting to that point of frustration. Why is it that our governments are not moving in the direction? Why is it that, for example, our colleagues in Malaysia can take just 1 hour to renew their passport, while this individual now in our Caribbean states has to go to a more rural location in order to do that? And then they're lucky if they get back that passport within a week or two. So, Mr. Cadell, I know that you are leading the charge around digitalization. of the Barbados Government Services. You want to share with us what's the overall objective of your mission?
Thank you, Justin. Well, first let me say that I think when it comes to the role of government in this area, it's twofold. One is to create the environment for digital transformation of the country and the economy, and the other is to become, as government, in the provision of services ourselves, digital by default. So I think, you know, it is on the one hand about how we diversify our economy, again, as we were saying yesterday, towards one that is less about your physical location and being a physical presence, because that constrains you for reasons that have to do with climate resilience and others. But the other is about how we change the way that we do things as government. And the first part of that is that we have to take ourselves less seriously as government. I think that governments have had a very big role in doing things in economies and in countries, and that we have to see ourselves more as a facilitator of what happens in countries. We have to see ourselves as service providers. We provide services, and we're supposed to create the environment for people to get things done. So I think that that's a shift that has started to happen. For example, in Barbados, and perhaps it has something to do with having slightly younger leadership in general. But I know that in Barbados, for example, in cabinet, we don't use paper in cabinet. We have a secure network where we access cabinet papers, and everything is on a tablet. And you know, even in my ministry with my team, every now and then they'll say, "We send it to you," and I'll pick up my phone and say, "What? I don't see it." Because if it was sent on a file, chances are, well, that's not the kind of thing I'm looking for. So I think digital by default has been the approach, and it's not just because we want to be digital, it's because we are going back to first principles. Why is it that we are doing what we do? So what is the good that we're trying to provide? What is the point of it? Or what is the public mischief that we're trying to avoid? And that goes beyond the digital approach. It goes really to our approach to everything that we do, and that's why you've seen such sweeping reforms with respect to our Planning and Development Act that we just passed in January, because really we're looking to see how we can apply digitalization and technologies to make things easier, to save time, to become more efficient, to make people's lives easier, because that is going to get us closer to our goals of inclusiveness and equality. So that is the purpose. And as we go on, I'll share some of the examples and where we think that we've made some strides, or perhaps where we think that we need to accelerate.
Okay. Thank you, Minister Cadell. Sounds good. Let's hope it pans out that way. But Aldwin, you're based here in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm probably putting you on the spot here. I know you don't work in government. You're an entrepreneur.
Right.
But how do you see things panning out here in Trinidad?
So I actually agree with the Minister 100%. In Trinidad, the government acts as a facilitator for our solution. So I'll give you a little story about how we got into government and e-payments in Trinidad. So if you looked at the first panel between Gabby and Professor, it kind of displayed exactly what is happening across the Caribbean. You have a set of innovators, trying to take one direction, and you have government saying, "Hang on, we think this is the better direction for you to take." So what we did in Trinidad was observe, the trend, and say, let's come right down the middle. Let's work with what the government would accept as part of the course, but still innovate. So we had a situation where the Judiciary of Trinidad and Tobago, they wanted to streamline payments into court, right here. They invited financial institutions because the amount of money to manage was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So they expected was companies or people to manage that would have been a financial institution. However, when they look at the solutions that banks and these companies had to provide, it wasn't focused to the unbanked. So how could we get into something like this if we're not a financial institution? We said we would run on the rails of a financial institution, so we make Professor and those types happy, and we would create a digital solution that would make the unbanked happy, because the unbanked had no need or did not want to go to a bank to set up an account, right? Or in the case of the judiciary, a lot of the clients weren't able to meet the requirements for opening a new bank account, right? But in the case of court payments, it doesn't matter if you have a bank account or not, you need to make the payment, right? So we looked at the market, being in the space for the last 5 years in Jamaica, looking at mobile payments and trying to figure out why it's not working. We saw NCBJ, as you mentioned, Michael, went out to M-Pesa and brought in developers to make a Quisk in Jamaica, but had relatively low success. And their approach was built on the African's approach. In Africa, M-Pesa worked because the availability of a ATM or a bank was non-existent. You had to travel hundreds of miles. In the Caribbean, although we have a large unbanked population, it's not because a bank was hard to find. It was a matter of it was just difficult or a choice. We didn't want to have to go and give our time to provide all this KYC information or get all these documents that was required. So it was a matter of choice for Caribbean people not to have a bank account rather than limited by geography, which is what caused M-Pesa to be successful. So seeing that, that failure, we looked at what was successful for the unbanked and top-ups. Phone card top-ups, which exist since the early 2000s, is how us in the Caribbean digitize our money. We will take our cash, go to a location, get a phone card top-up, and enter it into our phone. We just digitize our cash. So looking at our culture, we found a way to have the unbanked interact with an application that would form inclusion for their services. Right. So we built a platform that's exactly like the phone card network that allows you to go and buy a phone card top-up but make payments to the judiciary. So that solution is what enabled us to find success with the government of Trinidad and Tobago, right, because we provided a solution that was geared towards the customer. We could bring down Bitcoin and Alpha Coin and OmniCoin. It doesn't resonate with the doubles vendor. It doesn't resonate with the guy that has a pop-up shop in a corner. The only thing he understands is cash. But how do we digitize cash for government services? Was find a solution that he currently understands. So the learning curve for our product was for anyone who has a prepaid phone, which if you do any of the research, between Digicel and Flow, that's 90%. Everyone has a prepaid phone. Everyone knows how to top up. So we get our technology around the customer rather than build a solution and tell government this is how it had to be. So when we walked into the judiciary with a solution that the customer liked, it was easy for government to put regulations in place around a solution that they saw 10, 20,000 people, 20,000 customers walking with.
So thanks for that, because it sounds like a very interesting private-public partnership. And also a good use of data to help you to come to the right solution. Mr. Cadell, in your approach of digitalizing government, are you looking at the data? Are you trying to ensure that whatever you do will also be inclusive?
Well, we have to. We are talking about making it easier for every service or every part of government to be accessible to everyone. So by default, we have to be inclusive. And I have to emphasize that this is less about moving to digitalization because that in itself is good, but it is about how we are making sure that we are including everyone. So I'll give you an example. And it is also a huge part of our doing business environment. One of the reasons that in June last year we started with the town and country planning process is that we looked at the process and we realized that in fact a lot of these solutions would be technology solutions. So it's not that we started off by saying, well, we want to digitalize government, but we looked at what we were doing and we thought in order to deliver this in a more efficient way, we would have to make it accessible online. So we created this e-planning platform. The e-planning platform allows people to make their applications online, but it also allows us, between the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment, the Town and Country Planning Office, Coastal Zone Management Unit, and all the other agencies that have to make a decision on the application to speak to each other. Because what was happening before is that a file would have to leave Warren's, and one would have to go to Bay Street, and another would have to go to 10 different locations for officers to sit down and look at files, and then a messenger would have to take a file. I mean, when you sit down in a first principles process and ask questions about what every process that is completed and why, then you start to realize, but hang on, this is a lot of time that we're wasting. This is a lot of money that we're spending. And not only that, you know, we talked in the lecture a couple nights ago about the idea of displacement of labor. But it's also, this is a resource that is not being optimized. And that's what we're doing through our modernization project now, that we're pleased to have the IDB supporting us with, is that one of the things we're looking at is how do we also use this process to change the structure of work and to redeploy resources so that you may not be sitting stamping a set of plans for town planning because there was somebody doing that. But you, in fact, might be moved to a process that is more efficient so that you're not necessarily removed from work, but that what we're helping to do is to help upskill some of those workers to make sure that they are part of a new digital environment. So it's what we're finding, whether it's town planning, whether it's corporate registry, whether it's getting liquor licenses online. Crop over is coming. And we have a lot of promoters who are frustrated all the time because to hold a simple fete, to hold a fish fry, to hold anything, you have to go and get police permission for that. You have to get a liquor license. You have to get permission from, you know, the body that deals with our artists, and permission to play music and copyright and so on. And what we've said is, listen, we need a one-stop shop for many of these things. Right. But it is about how we use the digitalization process, digitalization of government, to modernize. We call our project a modernization project because it gives us the opportunity to look at, well, these people who were stamping things and doing this very analog system, how can we invest in them to make sure that they are part of a new digital economy? So it goes to the point Avi was making earlier about the fact that this is not just about building platforms, which are important, and I love the approach of the private sector in Trinidad, which is saying, let me build something that we can show you the usefulness of. Right. And we would love for the private sector to do that in the context of government services. But it's not just about creating platforms or what the platform is. It is that this process allows governments to modernize everything that we do. It allows us to find applicability across a range of sectors, and it is really the transformation that will push us in the right direction, because it starts to open up all the other questions of labor and human resources, of how we're getting value added across sectors, and you know, the word that is behind us at the top of the screen, that is what we're talking about. It's not just digital transformation, it's transformation writ large across our economies.
Okay. So it seems as if digitalization is, we shouldn't see it as a threat. There's a lot of opportunities there for us, and I agree with that analysis. Now, if we all know that digitalization holds so much promise for us. Aldwin, you're working across the region. If I look at the screen here, the questions that are being asked, are our governments really serious about this? Are they digitalizing fast enough?
Well, make sure who's here. Yes. No. The thing is, I think innovators, I mean, I just had a conversation with Gabby before we start. We're missing the boat. Trinidad, the Caribbean, our culture is slightly different, you know, from the rest of the world. Our government, you know, belongs to this culture. So we can't walk in here with, you know, I mean, a new technology and expect them to say, oh, that's fantastic, we're going to implement it. We need to take baby steps with government, no offense. You walk in and you present something that they are comfortable with. And this is what we did again. This is how we were successful. We didn't come in and say, listen, we have this brand new, you know, digital fiat that's going to revolutionize Trinidad. We walked in and said, listen, we could do online payments with bank instruments, credit card payments, but, you know, we're going to leave a huge sector of our population, you know, disenfranchised, you know, 80% who doesn't have credit cards. So we came up with a solution that, since we are, you know, regulated by, you know, Visa and MasterCard as a PayFac, we built our solution on that same rails for the digital fiat, the cash. And we presented that as an option. So it was small bites, small chunks, to allow government to chew on and understand that what we're coming with is a solution that the unbanked might be able to use. We didn't we didn't come across with, you know, wholesale changes, which is just small amounts that they will be able to change within their current government capacity. We had the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago amend a couple laws to allow our solution to function, which was easily digested by both the government and the opposition. So it received the votes to move forward. It wasn't a wholesale change. So these incremental steps towards the end game of, you know, total digitization would allow for governments to give innovators like myself the environment to innovate, to get in place.
Well, Aldwin, when I listen to Gabriel Abed,
right,
Kirk Anthony Hamilton,
right,
you know, they're, I think, within your age cohort as well.
Right.
They are suggesting to us that we can't move along at that pace anymore. The incremental steps are not going to be fast enough for us.
For sure.
And when you say it's our culture, I somehow feel it might be more than just culture that's preventing us from moving forward. So there might be special interests as well.
For sure.
Minister, how are you going to deal with this? Because it sounds to me that you really want to move Barbados forward, and I don't think you want to do it in incremental steps.
Not at all. In fact, I don't know what's happening here in Trinidad and Tobago, but I will have to say that in Barbados, we are ready for wide-scale transformation. We are policymakers. If there's something that we need to do to transform our economy and society, we are able to make the legislative changes. Some of it, I agree, has to be based on consultation with our people. And so some of the slower steps might not be about government, but might be about bringing everyone along, because we are talking about entire populations and that you have to engage, you have to speak with. But certainly, we are the legislators. So for example, we had to bring a new data protection act to govern a lot of what we are doing on the digitalization and modernization side. Who gets to look at this information once we've created this platform that makes data move seamlessly between agencies? Who gets to access it? You know, under what conditions can it be shared? And you know, we've already gone with that new legislation. We had to bring new legislation for planning and development. We're going to have to bring new legislation in terms of our Statistical Act. So we, in fact, in the last year, have brought significant legislation that has allowed us to change the way that we interact as government with the population and interact with each other. So I would say to the private sector, and I saw a question there, I'm preempting your role a little bit, Justin, but the questions are fantastic. I saw a question there about how is government going to move towards this modernized digital environment, given the fact that we have these fiscal constraints. Yes. And really, it is going to be about partnership with the private sector. So don't hold back.
So I just want to jump in so I can clarify my incremental point.
Good. Okay.
So we launched the system with government in, I think it was August last year. And within August to December, we actually had 2 laws amended. So I may mention incremental, but that's for the government to consume what we were saying. 2 laws amended within 6 months. That's, well, in Trinidad anyway. That's aggressive. But how we were enabled, or how we were allowed to have that happen, is we provided a solution that they could understand, and then results that he could see. Right. So in October, we had the payment to the courts, which was the act that was amended for our solution. And then in December, when they were passing the Financial Act of 2018, they amended what payments into government and the title of a collector was, which included our type of service. So the only reason I mentioned the incremental approach was to bridge the gap between Avi and Mr. Prasad, and Professor Prasad, and Gabriel. So we don't go back and forth on stages like this, because this was happening in Trinidad.
Yes.
Months after months saying, hey, we need to do this, and this one saying, okay, let's do it. No, you can't do it. And you spend months just arguing the same point. We said, listen, government, we're just going to do this one little change. Okay, we accept that. And then 1 month later, one more change. Okay, we accept that. And then within 2 months or 4 months, we have an entire law changed.
Yes.
And that's our approach. Again,
good.
Incremental for government in Trinidad. In Barbados, it seems like you're more aggressive, so maybe I should come across to Barbados.
I'm happy that you clarified that. I'm sure my Trinidad and Tobago colleagues in the room are happy to hear that as well. I see the numbers are red on the screen here. I just want to ask you one final question for both of you. It was the question was up earlier around a unique digital ID system. At the William Demas lecture on Tuesday, Estonians utilize this system very effectively to make transactions seamless throughout the economy, throughout the society. We saw recently that in Jamaica, we had a bit of a hiccup, and so the government has to go back to the drawing board. Do you see utility of us moving towards such a system? And even as Gabriel Abed has said, why can't we not do this at a regional level instead of now trying to only come up with national systems? Is it possible?
It's definitely possible. I mean, in Barbados, we are moving towards the model that was presented during the lecture. Now, we have to make sure that that the model that we do adopt, that is adapted to what we need to do. But as was said, I think that we already have the platform, the idea of having a national identifier. I think that people are already comfortable with that idea. And people also want, as Therese said earlier, people want to be able to live their lives on their phones. I do. So people want to be able to access key services, and also want to be able to trust that their information is secure, and that is the role that government can play. The role of trust is the role for government. So to make sure And that can't be, that can't be kind of delegated to the private sector. We have to make sure that we set up in terms of legislation and regulation, for people to know that their data is safe. But I think that the point about having this facilitated at the regional level is important. If we look at how we operate as the CSME, the issues of contingent rights, issues of social security and insurance and being able to move your rights across borders, it's going to become important. But I do think that we first have a commitment to our citizens to be able to do this at a national level, to be able to demonstrate its usefulness. For example, and I mean, this has application across so many things. You talked about the payments within the court system, and how our courts are able to provide services for citizens. We're talking about things like transfers between custodial parents and non-custodial parents that have for decades been a challenge. So how are we able to make sure that those payments are made easily? And how are we also able to remove discretion from government decision making? This is one of the key things that digitalization allows us to do. The more we can automate some of the things that we know we want to do. So what are the reasons that we say no? And this is something that Avi and I have been working on a lot in terms of modernization across the board, with our fiscal incentives.
Right.
We have these systems where we expect that we're going to say no. And so we set up ourselves to say no rather than to say yes. But if we use this process to say, listen, there are a very narrow set of circumstances in which the answer is going to be no, in which you're going to have to stop the process and a person is going to have to step in and review this thing. This gives us an opportunity to be able to remove this kind of, and you talked about the role of interest groups earlier, remove this kind of discretionary approach to decision making, because there's a certain automaticity to how things are done. So, for example, with the fiscal incentives framework, we know that if you present these certain criteria, that we can get you to a yes in 5 days.
Right.
So rather than having all of these people come and want to sit with us and ask for special considerations, if you fulfill certain criteria, we can guarantee you'll have if it's a yes, you'll have it within 5 days.
Yeah.
And that is the kind of value that investors are going to prioritize. That's the kind of value that citizens are going to want to have from these automated, digitalized processes. And so we think that once people start to have confidence in the benefits, that the trust is going to come and people are going to be open to having this idea of unique identifiers and having information flow seamlessly across agencies.
Alderman, finally, over to you. What do you think about this?
So yeah, I think Gabby is spot on with this. We, as English-speaking Caribbeans, we're just about 10 million people. The value in any solution is the value you can provide to the people that has to use it. And there's no sense in creating a solution in Trinidad, and we have the single Caribbean market, and I can't use it in Barbados, or Jamaica, or St. Lucia, or Guyana, for that matter. So yes, we are spread out a large geographical location, but we are still very small in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
So if we're developing a system, as Gabby keeps saying, it should be able to spread across the region and provide value to all Caribbean people. That's the power that I think with his platform that he's trying to get at. As a Caribbean unit, we now have bargaining power with the US and all the rest of the world. But we need to start working together. We need to have this one platform, not payments, I'm talking about affecting digital solutions across the region, whether it be a unified identification program. So my ID card, if I go to Barbados tomorrow, could bring up all my information in Trinidad so I can start a business tomorrow, because it's verified by a system in Trinidad that you in Barbados would accept. It would only improve the lives of the entire Caribbean. So for government, for the Caribbean on the whole, I think the approach has to be a Caribbean-wide one.
Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing your perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please give them a round of applause? It sounds to me that, yes, the unique ID system is something that we should be moving towards, and we need to have interoperability across the region. We may not want necessarily to have a regional ID, but if there's interoperability, I think that can get us to a happy medium. We're at that point. We need to wrap up. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you enjoyed the discussions here this morning. I want to thank our panelists. The first panel was very lively, so I want to thank Michelle, Avi, we can refer to you now as Avi, and of course Gabby, for giving us a very lively discussion around regulation and fintech. I think that was quite wonderful. Therese, we're on first name basis here. Thank you so much for coming and spending your time with us and sharing your remarkable experience and moderating what I thought was a very wonderful discussion around entrepreneurial activity and also around e-government as well. David and Anthony, thank you so much for being here with us. It's a little tricky one, but I'm going to do it. Marsha. And Wayne, thank you so much for spending the morning with us and sharing with us your perspectives on what you think we need to move towards a digital governance system. Folks, I think policymakers in the room, you heard what the panelists had to say. Yes, I think there are strategies that we can use, but I think we really want to start moving towards that digital future. We at the Caribbean Development Bank are here ready to support you in that initiative. Our President yesterday in his opening remarks to our Board of Governors emphasized that word up there, transformation. And I think utilizing digitalization to move us to that promised land is the way for us to go. So thank you once again for staying with the course with us. And now we have to move over to the closing ceremony. Thank you.